So this is a set of ideas that have been developed with just graduated student Alex Hickok and former student John Venezia. So I want to give them credit right up front. In a sense, what I'm going to be talking about today is trying to figure out what's going on with these two frontal nodes that we called speech articulatory network or whatever in the dual stream model. Lots of us have known of the existence of these two different areas involved in speech and language, but there hasn't been a really good resolution in terms of or understanding in terms of what they're doing, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I do want to kind of give you some background on where my thinking started on this, for what it's worth. There was a few observations coming out of my lab from my students and former students that started me thinking, as is often the case, the work of your students inspires you. And one of them was by Vache Baboyan, who recently graduated, doing some connectome mapping of repetition behavior in post-stroke aphasia. Classically, of course, we think that it's the arcuate fasciculus, or at least that's the classic story. But his results shown here indicate two different connectivity patterns to frontal areas, one ventral and one dorsal. And interestingly, the dorsal one was connected to more auditory areas. The ventral one was connected to more somatosensory areas. So I thought that was interesting. Alex Hickok was working on parcellation, completely different project, working on functional connectivity parcellation of the planum temporale, so this region back here. And what this map shows are regions that are functionally connected, like colors are connected to each other. And again, what I noticed was that inferior frontal areas tended to have connectivity with more somatosensory areas. More dorsal areas, these yellow and black ones, had connectivity with more auditory areas, including around SPT. Again, a completely independent observation came from John Venezia, where he's been working on mapping spectrotemporal receptive fields in auditory cortex. And we noticed in some of the studies that he was doing that there was also mappable regions in the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe that line up pretty nicely with these speech-related areas. So all of these things started getting me thinking, what is it about these dorsal areas and auditory processes that are driving, what's going on here? It seems auditory, the ventral one seems somatosensory, and that drove me to the literature. As always, I like to start in the beginning. So as you know, in the beginning was Brocas Area, which according to Broca was the seat of articulate speech. And he was clear about what he meant there, which is that it's the faculty to coordinate the proper movement of articulated language. So relatively low level ability here. That was Broca's idea. Geschwin concurred. Here's a quote from Geschwin about a little more than 100 years later. Brocas area, which is adjacent to the region of the motor cortex that controls the movement of the muscles of the lips, the jaw, the tongue, the soft palate, and the vocal cords, apparently incorporates programs for the coordination of these muscles in speech. Now, we know better now. So we've been studying Broca's area for a long time, and we know that it's multifunctional, it's not so simple, and it's been implicated in a lot of things, none of which are particularly low level. So things like cognitive control, lexical selection, syntax, sequencing of various sorts, and so on, working memory, the list goes on. So where then is this faculty of articulate speech that Broca was talking about? Modern data seem to suggest there are two. Both are in premotor cortex on the precentral gyrus, not in Broca's area. And one is posterior to Broca's area in ventral premotor cortex. One is more dorsal. So roughly in these locations on Broca's original patient, which were damaged, as we now know. So I'm going to talk about 4 different sources of evidence. So the first part of this talk is going to be trying to make the case for 2 speech coordination areas. And we're going to look at fMRI, direct cortical stimulation, Apraxia of speech, which is probably the closest syndrome to what Broca was interested in studying or thought he was studying. And then a connectome mapping of repetition and aphasia, which I've already previewed. That was Vache Baboyan's study. So let's start with functional imaging. those of us who have been looking at speech and functional imaging have known for quite a while that there are two areas, at least in the frontal lateral frontal cortex, that respond during both listening to speech and speaking. And these include, going back to Kathy Price's early work in the 90s, you get this, and I'm highlighting here, the dorsal region. This is from our own repetition, listen and rehearse SPT localizers. I was more interested in SPT, now I'm interested in this guy. And this is Stephen Wilson's seminal work on areas responding both to the perception and production of speech, same areas. And of course, that's why we ended up, or I drew two different frontal zones involved in our speech articulatory processes. That's the functional imaging literature. It's quite clear that we have these two areas. Next, we turn to evidence from direct cortical stimulation mapping. I think the definitive study came out just this year. It's a multi-site retrospective sample of almost 600 patients. They mapped two abilities, or two disruptions: speech arrest, which is the complete interruption of overt counting without oral facial muscle movement. So essentially, this is kind of a speech coordination deficit in the sense that it seems to be relatively low level. You get a complete interruption, but you don't get any after discharges in motor areas causing twitches. So it's not completely like M1. Anomia was the other thing they identified, which is the inability to name a picture while still being able to speak. So patients, for example, would say, it's and then either made an error or couldn't come up with it and so on. So not a speechy problem. So that identifies a higher level language area. All right, what's the data? Here's the distribution of sites. There's almost 1,000 of them associated with speech arrest. Density map of the whole thing shows a focus on the precentral gyrus. Notice it's not Brocas area center, and it's ventral. But if you do a cluster analysis, which they did, you get two, and we're going to ignore the other zones for now. You get two premotor areas showing up here. So they write, the peak of the speech arrest was found to be localized to the ventral part of the precentral gyrus. That's here, not the classic Brocas area. And yes, we see both ventral and dorsal premotor clusters consistent with the imaging work. Anomia has a different distribution, not as many sites. And you can see that the focus is more Brocas area. So that suggests that this is not a speech coordination area, which we already knew anyway, but this is nice confirmation. Turning to apraxia of speech, this is, like I said, probably the closest thing to what Broca was interested in studying, which he called aphemia, which is more of a speech coordination or sequencing deficit. So something lower level. It's typically thought not to be an aphasia, instead a motor speech problem. And so it's of interest with respect to what we're talking about today. The neuroanatomy is controversial, and I want to avoid the controversy. What I do want to do is point out that both ventral, including insula, there's debates about that, anterior insula, and dorsal premotor areas have been implicated in different studies. Here's one representative study that I was involved with R.G. Hillis's group that mapped apraxia of speech, that's this top row here, in acute stroke using diffusion MRI. And what you can see, the light blue circle, if you can see that, shows Brocas area, and there's not much going on, maybe the posterior most aspect, but the highest concentration is posterior to that in the precentral gyrus, or right in the sulcus here. And it involves ventral and dorsal areas. You can get Brocas involved if you look at something higher level, like ask people to do a digit span. Interestingly, recent discussion about apraxia of speech centers around the possibility of there being two subtypes, which suggests possibly two different systems. And you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Maybe different subtypes of apraxia of speech map onto these two different speech areas. Interestingly, the two types that have been discussed are a prosodic type and a phonetic type. And now we return to the connectome mapping work of speech repetition. Of course, you know the classic view that it's the arcuate fasciculus that maps repetition ability. It's more complicated, of course. This is the view from neurosurgery showing, and we don't need to look into the details other than to note there are both ventral and dorsal connectivity regions, and it's much more complicated. Vache Baboyan was very interested in mapping these in a data-driven way. So rather than just asking whether the arcuate fasciculus was involved or SLF2 or 3 or whatever, he took a large sample. This is in collaboration with the C-STAR group of stroke patients, and used machine learning and out of sample prediction to identify pairwise connectivity in following stroke that was correlated or predictive of repetition ability. And this is the map he got. These were the pairwise connectivities that survived. There's a couple of local connectivities in the parietal cortex. That's interesting, not our focus today. But again, there's a dorsal auditory connectivity pattern and a ventral somatoconnectivity pattern. So all of this argues for the existence of two potentially separable speech coordination areas. So here's a kind of cartoon version of it. A dorsal premotor speech area, and this is introducing some terminology here. I'm going to call this dorsal region the dorsal premotor speech area, which isn't to say that it's exclusive or selective for speech. In fact, we think it's involved in singing and, as well, but just to highlight its prominent role in speech. And a ventral premotor speech area. Brocas area is up here, of course, the central sulcus, and the post-central gyrus here, pre-central gyrus. So this is premotor cortex, and this is the middle frontal gyrus. So this dorsal premotor speech area is right at the back of the middle frontal gyrus near the sulcus. Interesting historical note, Broca's second case, Lo Long, had a much more focal and predominantly premotor lesion, which you can see here, that extended up dorsally. Nina Dronkers was able to scan this brain, and you can see, we won't dwell on the details, but there's clear evidence of dorsal damage. This dorsal premotor speech area seemed to be affected, and interestingly, Broca noticed this. He said, the integrity of the third frontal convolution, that's what we call the inferior frontal gyrus today, and perhaps of the second, that's the middle frontal gyrus today, seems indispensable to the exercise of the faculty of articulate language. So Broca was potentially onto this much earlier. So interim summary, two motor speech areas, neither of which are Broca's area. So the question is, what are they doing? What are the differences? And there were two key recent clues. One of them I've hinted at. One has to do with the observation that the dorsal premotor speech area is involved in controlling voice pitch during singing and speaking. And second, that the same region codes pitch-related acoustic features during speech listening. So I'll talk about these two. First, the involvement in voice pitch during speaking. This is a direct cortical recording study by Eddie Chang's group. Neurosurgical patients spoke sentences with pitch accents on different words. So I never said she stole the money. I never said she stole the money. I never said she stole the money, and so on. And what you can see here are the raster plots of activations showing higher activation under the pitch accented regions. And here's a correlation plot of these things. So dorsal premotor cortex activity positively correlates with pitch height. Don't be confused by them calling it human laryngeal motor cortex. It's probably not primary laryngeal motor cortex. We'll get into that later. This is, we think, the dorsal premotor speech area. The same regions respond during listening as well. So it has an auditory response profile consistent with what we see in functional imaging, and it's correlated with pitch during singing. So it's not unique to just spoken language. Stimulating, the same study, stimulating this region elicits involuntary vocalizations, vowel-like vocalizations. They wrote that we did not observe any instances where stimulating the ventral laryngeal motor cortex, or this ventral speechy area, elicited vocalization, though previous studies have shown speech arrest from stimulating this location. So you get vocalizations when you stimulate this region. Turning now to a completely different study, this is the one that I hinted at previously by John Venezia, where again, he was interested in mapping spectrotemporal receptive fields in auditory cortex, and we had noticed this dorsal premotor area that also seemed quite mappable. And that's shown here, along with some points where we get auditory motor responses to speech. This is one of our studies. This is Stephen Wilson's study. And this is a study of interested in vocalization in general. You can see that it's pretty much the same area. Here is what the STRFs look like, and we don't have to digest the deep understanding of what these things mean. The relevant part is that this region of the modulation map corresponds to pitch-related cues, or in this zone here, and we see that in this map here. We're also found some mappable areas in more ventral areas, but you can see that this isn't the speech area, it's more anterior, and it does not show sensitivity to these pitch cues. Interestingly, this is kind of what the STRFs look like in primary auditory cortex. So it looks very auditory in interesting ways. There are also some interesting differences. Details are all in this, this recently published paper. So all of this leads to the primary hypothesis driven by the results that I've just described, that the dorsal premotor speech area, that's the abbreviation here, is involved in voice pitch coordination. That's the short version. The long version of the hypothesis is that it's part of a sensory motor control circuit for pitch-related vocalization, including prosody and song, and predominantly acts on the laryngeal effector via the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex, which is, as we'll see shortly, buried in the central sulcus, just behind this region. The ventral premotor speech area, we think, is involved in all the rest of the stuff, syllabic, phonetic coordination. It's part of a sensory motor control circuit for, like I said, syllabic and phonetic related speech features, and acts on supralaryngeal effectors, as well as voice, presumably we think, or guess, voicing related control of the larynx via the ventral laryngeal area, which is more controversial. We'll talk about that. So this portion is supported by evidence just reviewed, and this inference is basically what's left over to control once you factor out pitch-related control. All right, so to summarize this graphically, here's the old theory where Brocas area was controlling all of the articulators, including the larynx. The new theory is that the regions are in the precentral gyrus, and you have a partition. We have a partition between supralaryngeal, roughly, that is phonetic, syllabic things being controlled there, and pitch-related processes controlled more dorsally. All right, there are a set of secondary hypotheses that we're going to focus on for the rest of the talk. One is that there are that these networks are not phrenological islands; they are part of parallel hierarchies of speech coordination. That the dorsal premotor speech area, and this is where things get interesting. I didn't expect to go in this direction, but that's where the data pointed. It evolved from an attention/orienting hub in dorsal premotor cortex. This may be the most controversial aspect of what I'm saying today. The ventral premotor speech area evolved from voluntary control systems involving mastication, oral grasping, and perhaps non-vocal oral communication systems like lip smacking in non-human primates. This is not new. This is part of McNeelage's frame content theory. So what's new here is really the excising of this from the speech control circuit and linking it to dorsal attention orienting processes. So we're going to talk about this stuff, and the idea in terms of building the argument is that if these hold up, that provides even more support for the primary hypothesis of a distinction between these systems. So let's talk about parallel hierarchies. You're familiar with the ventral hierarchy. Here we have BA45, BA44, BA6. These probably are different levels of processes. Primary oral facial motor cortex. This may be involved in lexical or morphological sequencing. And these are kind of my best guesses, but insert your own favorites here. Something like a syllabary, as Lefelt and colleagues have claimed, or phonological sequencing. And BA6, most people would think it's involved in some aspect of phonetic speech coordination, and motor execution in M1. Now, the dorsal hierarchy, we're less accustomed to thinking about. So here there is a dorsal laryngeal motor cortex. We're going to talk about that. So that is voluntary laryngeal control at a low level, M1. And then voice pitch coordination. That's the present claim, which exists in this region of premotor cortex. And then there's this area 55B, which was recently discovered, and we don't really know what it's doing. We're going to talk about that. All right, so laryngeal motor cortex. This is a whole literature on its own that is controversial and interesting. the upshot, some of the debates are that maybe there's one laryngeal motor cortex, maybe there's two. A lot of people think there are two these days. So one is definitely, everyone agrees that there's a dorsal one in primary motor cortex. There's maybe a ventral one that some people debate whether we should call it motor cortex, laryngeal motor cortex, or something else. It's in premotor cortex, not primary motor cortex. And interestingly, this ventral one is what's shared with non-human primates. The dorsal one appears to be uniquely human, and most people agree on that fact. And that is thought to represent a key correlate of human vocal production learning, which is a big deal in the evolution of speech. We have the ability to learn complex vocal patterns, and that's shared with no other non-human primate that we know of. It is shared, of course, with songbirds, with bats, and with some sea mammals. So it's an interesting trait that's being studied extensively. This is just another more recent study showing that if you control for things like breathing and other things, you can map primary laryngeal motor cortex to the sulcal regions. This is still premotor cortex, even though it looks sulcal. Okay, so what is the relationship between the dorsal premotor speech area and the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex? Well, they're right up against each other. In fact, this is a kind of broad, without controlling for breathing, this is what looks like dorsal laryngeal motor cortex. If you control for breathing, it maps mostly to this area. This yellow is a coordinate for the dorsal premotor speech area, and you can see that they're tightly interconnected. In fact, what some people call the gyral dorsal laryngeal motor cortex maps nicely onto the dorsal premotor speech area. Sorry for all the acronyms. So we think of this as a kind of hierarchy. Now we turn to area 55B, which was rediscovered recently by Glasser in their multimodal parcellation based on human connectome project data. So here's 55B based on a myelin map, and you can see it outlined here, flanked by eye fields, lightly myelinated, moderately myelinated eye fields, and heavily myelinated motor areas. Part of the multimodal parcellation was they used both myelin and task fMRI to identify these as well as other things. And here is showing activation to a fairly high level linguistic task, sentence related. I believe it was story listening. And we can confirm this independently in a simple way. If you just go to Neurosynth and run a meta-analysis on the term syntactic, you get what a lot of people would expect, Brocas area, what many of us would expect, posterior temporal areas, but you also get this dorsal kind of not premotor, or just anterior to premotor, that maps nicely onto area 55B. So that is this region here. The anterior part of 55B shows this syntactic effect, which is interesting. Also interesting is the recent work that William Machin and our CSTAR team have been doing, looking at expressive agrammatism and other functions. This is a brand new study. I think William tweeted it out just yesterday that it was published. You can see the date 2022, it's very new. We looked at a lot of things, but what I want to focus on is this. One of the language functions that we mapped, and this is lesion symptom mapping. These are unthresholded lesion maps. I want to focus on the expressive agrammatism because what you see is a pretty intense focus in the posterior part of the middle frontal gyrus. Okay, so that same area is involved in syntax. And again, here's the relation between these areas that show a hierarchy. 55B, our dorsal premotor speech area, and primary dorsal laryngeal motor cortex. So the guess is that, this probably isn't, what aspect of syntax is it? And the guess is that it's something related to morphosyntactic prosodic planning. And that guess is based on the fact that these are pitch related, and that's obviously connected to prosody. You might ask whether this idea can explain syntactic disruption in agrammatism. Can damage to a prosodic planning system cause expressive agrammatism? And the answer is maybe so. I'll read a quote from Stephanie Shattuck-Ufnagel's work on prosodic frames in speech production. She writes, we provide evidence to suggest that speakers generate a phrase level structural plan for an utterance, not new, that this plan is abstract in form and changes dynamically during the planning process, specifying its phonemic elements in greater and greater detail as the planning process unfolds. Again, not particularly new, but that this planning framework corresponds to prosodic structure. So her argument is that the backbone of phrasal planning is prosody. And if you disrupt the backbone, you could very well end up with something like expressive agrammatism, something that will need to be investigated. All right, so why is it dorsal? It's sitting up there in dorsal premotor cortex. What is it doing up there? And here's the argument that ventral premotor areas didn't, in our evolutionary history, didn't have the right kind of auditory input needed for vocal production learning. So if you look back in our lineage, it appears that these ventral areas were involved in voluntary, monkeys have voluntary control over these oral facial systems, but voluntary oral facial control in monkeys. They can, use their mouths to grasp things, and they can learn to point with their tongues and control a cursor and so on. But you don't need auditory input to control things like chewing or mouth grasping and so on. Somatosystem is more relevant, which is consistent with those hints that we had early on that I pointed out at the front. Dorsal premotor areas, on the other hand, in monkeys get auditory input as part of an orienting system. The frontal eye fields are up there and so on. So given that motor control is driven by sensory inputs, the idea is that the sensory architecture, where you have more auditory inputs going into dorsal premotor areas in our last common ancestor, drove the evolution of motor coordination for laryngeal control in that region of the brain. That's the basic idea. So here's some of the evidence for that. We're going to talk about dorsal premotor cortex, frontal eye fields, and orienting for the next few slides. So here's just a review paper describing that the caudal region of monkey auditory cortex responds to sound location. This is part of Roshecker's Ware stream, project to the caudal principal sulcus, frontal eye fields, and dorsal premotor cortex. So that is this region in macaque monkeys. Interestingly, so we normally think of localization as involving intraoral time differences and level differences, but spectral cues are used as well to localize in the vertical dimension. So that's important for orienting, making the case that it's not just time delay information that's getting up there. With respect to the frontal eye fields, now, despite their name, they are not eye selective. Instead, they control other orienting responses like head movement and so on, and are thought to be part of a broader orienting and attention network. Just to point out again that the frontal eye fields in humans, there's a frontal eye field and a premotor eye field, sandwiches area 55B. So that's right in between those two regions, and we think that that's not a coincidence. This proposed phylogenetic relationship between vocal pitch coordination and orienting may explain the correlation between vocal pitch height and up-down orienting responses during singing and talking. So it turns out when you raise your voice, when you sing or talk, your eyebrows tend to go up. You tend to orient more in the up direction. Here's Ariana Grande, presumably not singing a low note. It may also explain the correlation between prosodic features and co-speech gesture, which are tightly interrelated. And the connection here is that orienting involves not only orienting with the eyes, it involves orienting with the limbs. So think pointing, for example. And this brings us to the evolution of language. Now, you never thought you were going to see Ariana Grande, Hillary and Bernie and Darwin on one scientific slide in a coherent way, but here you go. For the last bit of this talk, I'm going to discuss the implications of this for general theories of the evolution of language, starting, as we always do when we talk about evolution, with Darwin. He had his own thoughts about where language came from. He wrote, "Primeval man, or rather some early progenitor of man, probably first used his voice in producing true musical cadences, that is, in singing, And we may conclude from a widespread analogy that this power would have been especially exerted during the courtship between sexes, would have expressed various emotions such as love, jealousy, triumph, and would have served as a challenge to rivals. So this is essentially the function that birdsong plays in birds. Darwin was saying that an early stage in the evolution of language probably involved song. So an early ancestor of ours was a song species of some sort. Now, the view that I've been promoting today supports this, song first view. And first is probably the wrong term to use. Everything is complicated and intertwined, but maybe a song early hypothesis would be better. So it supports this view in the following way. So we've identified a circuit that is distinct from orofacial motor control that could have been the target of evolution of voluntary laryngeal control and vocal production learning. So if you have a separate system that seems to be controlling song-related functions, that lends some support to the view that that could have evolved independently and presumably first. Furthermore, we have suggested a linkage of this circuit to orienting networks, and that linkage links an additional domain, which is social cognition. So think shared attention, eye gaze awareness, and so on, which is thought to be a pre-adaptation for language. And think about, eye gaze control involves these orienting responses. It's part of a social cognition system, and it's all linking up with this pitch-related control system. So Fitch has made this case explicitly, so this is nothing new that I'm saying here. He wrote a heightened awareness of the gaze of others and volitional control of one's own eyes, both of which play important roles in old world primate social behavior and understanding, suggests that the abstract and amodal computations involved in language, whether spoken or sign, had a pre-adaptive foundation in the social and visually guided aspects of gaze. So he's saying that this was an important foundational feature or pre-adaptation that enabled language that involves these dorsal premotor areas involved in orienting and attention. And what we're claiming is that the ability to control the larynx for vocal learning evolved out of these systems. And that's what explains the spatial relationship between them in the brain and the correlation between orienting responses, prosody, and gesture. Now, a comment on gesture. There's often a debate, either or debate, whether vocal speech evolved first or whether gesture evolved first, and it's usually considered to be, it's either one or the other. People are starting to think that maybe they co-evolved, that they don't have to be one or the other, that gesture and speech or song evolved together, which makes sense. We do gesture and we do have song-like prosody as remnants in our own language ability. So the view that I've been promoting today is consistent with some co-evolution during this early stage of language evolution. They do co-evolve developmentally in children. They coexist in our own speech. And all of this, the claim here is that this is grounded in this dorsal premotor orienting hub. Now, later, so with respect to the control of the speech articulators in the supralaryngeal tract, the idea here is that once you had a control of the larynx and you could produce communication through song, you can then start modulating these vocalizations by configurations of the vocal tract. And an interesting and fairly well accepted idea these days is Peter McNeelage's frame content theory of speech evolution. And here the idea is that there are open closed jaw cycles that are used for example, mastication. That ability to oscillate between open and closed cycles was coordinated with the ability to produce phonetic gestures. So different configurations, different endpoints of that open and closed cycle. The open portions, of course, correspond to vowels. The closed portions correspond to consonants. Once you get coordinated control over that, then you can start producing syllables with phonetic content. So the frame is the syllable, the open closed cycle. The content is the phonetic gestures that are produced at the open and close phase of those things. And this is fairly well accepted. People think that this is related to ventral, the evolutionary developments in ventral speech areas, and this is perfectly consistent with our view here. The point here is that this probably came later, and other people have pointed out that one major limitation of this is that there's a missing link. If you can't generate voice, then you're not going to be able to modulate it with these frame content gestures. All right, so here's the model. I haven't talked too much about the inputs, but I have some. We don't think that it's just a motor hierarchy, that all of these are getting inputs from the back of the brain. So just to walk you through again, there is a dorsal premotor speech area that we think is involved in pitch coordination, which controls the dorsal laryngeomotor cortex and then on down into the brainstem, nucleus ambiguous. Anterior to that is what I've called here the posterior middle frontal gyrus language area. That's up for grabs, what we actually call it. That's probably involved in phrasal prosodic planning. It is Shattuck-Nagel's prosodic planning network. And this receives extensive auditory input. Now, these terms here are meant to indicate that there's a strong bias for auditory input. It doesn't mean that that's the only source of input, but certainly this region is getting a lot of input from the auditory system. The ventral hierarchy is what we are pretty much familiar with. You have oral facial motor cortex, which includes some laryngeal representation somewhere in here. A ventral premotor speech area, which is the coordinating system that enabled the frame content model to be realized. And then you have higher level control, which my best guess is this is doing something like lexical selection or morphological sequencing or something like that, phonological sequencing, and so on. So that is basically the model. I've left plenty of time for discussion and comment, which I think there may be a bunch. So why don't I just stop there?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Greg. That was a great talk and food for thought, I'm sure. So let's go to the questions. The first one we have here is from Kirana Tsapkini. Wonderful talk, thank you. Is the dorsal speech larynx area only a speech larynx area, or do other computations take place there as well?
So you're talking about the dorsal laryngeomotor cortex. It's not known. It seems to be a larynx related area. So our best guess now is that it's doing laryngeal control, perhaps for pitch. That's basically the idea. But these laryngeal representations were just being discovered in the last decade or so, the mid 2000s. So there's a lot left to do in this area.
Great, thanks. I had a question. So do you think there are, or maybe specific apraxic or aphasic syndromes whose neural substrate is damaged to this dorsal premotor laryngeal area that you're focusing on? And if that's the case, how focal would those lesions have to be not to affect general oromotor movement as well? Or do you think that in most cases of that we call apraxia, if we only could look better, we would see that oromotor behavior is actually affected?
Yeah, I think this is one area that is ripe for a lot of new investigation. So the simple idea, which is probably wrong because the simple ones are often wrong, is that you have, anyone who knows speech, clinical speech, knows that apraxia of speech comes with phonetic symptoms, so phoneme substitutions and so on, distortions, but also prosodic components. And so those coexist. So the idea here, a simple idea is, and people have talked about those being two different subtypes of apraxia of speech. So the simple idea is that the prosodic variant is related to dorsal damage and the phonetic variant is as a result of ventral damage. But the kind of prosodic subtypes that people talk about don't map neatly onto the pitch-related control that I've been talking about. So I think there needs to be some work in characterizing different types of prosodic disruption. So oftentimes what you see in the prosodic type is kind of a lack of syllable timing. It's more syllable timing and rhythmic related prosody than pitch related prosody. So, so I think some more work needs to be done. There is an interesting case. Eddie Chang operated or reported a case. I don't actually know if he operated on it, but there was a resection of posterior middle frontal gyrus that produced a pure apraxia of speech that included prosodic deficits. So that is at least a single case study bit of evidence that you can have apraxia of speech from damage to this general vicinity.
Thanks. And just as a response, I think it's probably likely also that evidence will come from studies like Eddie Chang's work on ECOG or very minute sections, right? Rather than functional imaging at the coarse level that we're doing now, or lesion studies, which are even coarser.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks. Matt Davis has a question. Thanks for a really interesting talk. Can you say a bit about lateralization? There's a range of evidence that links right temporal areas to pitch perception, for example, acquired amusia, yet speech motor regions, including your DPMC region, are left lateralized. Any comments on this?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Good question. I am doing the typical thing that I do, which is to try to work out the intrahemispheric organization first and not worrying about the lateralization patterns so much. But that's a fair question. Some of the pitch-related control work from Eddie Chang's direct cortical recordings were in the right hemisphere. So, and the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex is bilateral. But you're right that the apraxic deficits that are seen and so on seem to be left dominant. So there is some dominance patterns to be worked out. It may differ as a function of whether we're talking about speech and prosody and integrating sentences, or whether we're talking about singing or other things like that. So the short answer is I don't know. There are interesting lateralization questions and problems to be worked out, and that's something that will need to be investigated. Good question.
Thank you. Question from Tom Savalis. Historical linguists hypothesized tone language systems developed from increased attention to pitch effects from consonantal aerodynamics. Any info about tone and prosody mapping differently to the dorsal and ventral areas?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, one of the things that we've gotten interested in, so we played around with altered auditory feedback, and this is not exactly on your question, but it's related, I think. Altered auditory feedback, the two paradigms that people use is altered F0, which obviously is a pitch control, and then altered F1, which is a phonetic control. And there's preliminary evidence that the circuits involved are slightly different regions of the planum temporale, and ever so slightly suggestions that there may be dorsal ventral distinctions in frontal areas, but that needs to be investigated. So there's the possibility of doing pitch tone related control for in tone languages to study some of these things using paradigms like altered auditory feedback and so on. So while I don't know of any evidence related to this, I think it's something that could be readily studied using paradigms that are already in existence.
Okay, thank you. Question from Elliot Murphy. Great talk. Do you know what the timing of activation of these premotor speech areas are relative to articulation onset?
Eddie recorded that information. It is, I could go back to the slide and show you. It's in his paper. One of the graphs I showed had timing information. One of the interesting things about the frontal eye fields, though, and I don't know if this is kind of tangential to your question, but there are apparently very fast, ultra fast responses to sensory stimulation, including auditory, in the frontal eye field region, which would be important for orienting. You hear a sound, you want to be able to react to it quickly. So there are these fairly low level, very fast acting cortical connections to this region, which is quite interesting and maybe relevant for vocal learning. But I think the direct answer to your question, Elliot, is in Eddie's paper.
And we have a question from Neil Fotidar. I'm not entirely sure, sorry. Fascinating session, thank you. Direct cortical stimulation in chronic epilepsy patients near the inferior bank of the precentral gyrus often produce cessation of spontaneous speech. This is known as primary negative motor area. We differentiate it from Brocas during DCS because patients also stop moving the contralateral hand. Do you think this primary negative motor area is the ventral premotor speech area that you are referring to?
Yeah, I do think that. If it's on the precentral gyrus ventrally, that and it's producing speech arrest, that maps nicely onto that large study of where speech arrest is elicited with ventral stimulation.
Okay. I don't see another question here, which gives me a chance to ask one of my own while other people are typing. Can you make a relation to the area that you're now focusing on and your hierarchical state feedback control model, where I don't have the model in front of me, but my recollection would say that phonemic control, I think, was also associated with I'm not sure if it was this area. You'll have to correct me.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't thinking in terms of two different speech areas. So, and what I was talking about was mostly supralaryngeal phonetic control in that paper. So I would say that that model applies more to the ventral system, the hierarchy in the ventral system, where you would have the ventral premotor speech area is kind of where the lower level phonetic control is happening. And presumably that links up to cerebellar circuits as you get to lower level control. Whereas the higher level I was thinking of as being more auditory, but there's not a lot of evidence for really strong auditory input even into BA44. This is something that I've started looking at more carefully now. There is, but it's not clear what it's doing, what it's actually coding, what kind of input is coming in. So to answer your question directly, that model was mostly about hierarchies in the ventral system. How this dorsal system fits into that, I think it's another dimension, to be honest.
So we can expect a new model.
The parallel hierarchical model, I don't know.
The string theory of neurolinguistics. Great.
Apparently I'm a splitter.
We have a question from Emily Garnett. We have a small cohort of stuttering researchers here, smiley, and we'd love it if you could speculate a little on what implications this dual speech control model might have for stuttering.
Oh gosh, I'm barely been able to pull this model together for this talk and to get my head around some of the basic concepts. I have not thought about stuttering. I have thought about stuttering with respect to feedback control, as have many other people. Ludo Max, Frank Gunther, a lot of people have thought about stuttering in connection with feedback control. And we've thought about it in general in the sense that what might be going on with stuttering is a noisy auditory motor internal model. That is, the mapping between auditory and motor circuits is noisy such that when you're planning speech, you generate a forward prediction to test the consequences in the auditory system. Since that mapping is noisy, it often introduces some error. So it makes a prediction that something that you didn't intend was going to come out. And that leads to a correction process, which introduces further error because it's a noisy mapping and so on. So that is, I think, a plausible, general, vague kind of explanation of stuttering. How these two circuits might work in, I mean, from now on, my thinking is going to have to be, well, if we have a speech disorder or something, are we talking, which circuit are we talking about? Are we talking about this pitch-related prosody control planning system or something more phonetic, frame content-like? And I haven't gotten there yet. Would love for people to start working on this or to reach out and talk about some of this stuff with me.
Yeah, one could also wonder, I guess, if there's such a thing as laryngeal stuttering, right?
Yeah, certainly. I mean,
types of.
Yeah, I mean, there are, stutterers who just phonate vowels, get stuck on a vowel. Yeah, it'd be interesting to, maybe there are some subcortical basal ganglia related things that have implications for both these circuits.
And Emily says, I didn't mean to put you too much on the spot. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Just on the stuttering, and then we have another question as well, just on the stuttering again. Sue Chang asks, dorsal PMC function seems to have huge implications for stuttering. No stuttering during whispering, which requires less laryngeal coordination with articulatory control, and greater stuttering when there is social pressure or orientation. We also see dorsal PMC show up all the time during group contrasts in fMRI data.
Yeah, maybe that's a rich area to study. Singing also is alleviates stuttering, right? So yeah, there could be some really interesting things in there. There's a lot of, I haven't had time to talk about a lot of things, but I mean, there are interesting dissociations with respect to FOXP2 disruption, where you get an apraxia of speech in affected people, but singing apparently is relatively preserved. Other, though, prosodic features can be affected. So there's a whole world of things that could be looked into here.
Another question from Kirana Tsapkini. Where does this dorsal speech area connect structurally to? Are the ventral and dorsal areas connected?
Yeah, so let me show you an analysis it's kind of an analysis that I did just this morning. So we've been working on that. Alex Tequico is the connectivity person in our group. But a former student, Brad Buxbaum, just made this little routine. There's Brad, he's in Toronto, where you could take the Glasser Atlas. Can you guys see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, you can take the Glasser Atlas. He took the Glasser Atlas and aligned it with a set of naturalistic, like people watching movies, data sets, 8 different naturalistic data sets. And you can generate connectivity. So go check it out. He tweeted it out yesterday. If you look him up, you can get a link to his site, and it's not documented well yet, and so don't take this as anything rigorous. I'm sure it is rigorous knowing Brad, but I don't really know what is being measured here necessarily. Nonetheless, if you look at the connectivity with 55B, what you see is, interestingly, connectivity with frontal eye fields and posterior kind of SPT-like regions, including, maybe auditory related stuff. If you look at 6V, which is closer to the ventral premotor area, you don't see connectivity in auditory related areas. Less connectivity with these like frontal eye fields, but more connectivity with sensory areas. Interestingly, I went back to this one zone that showed the highest connectivity with 55B, looked at its connectivity, and it picks up the entire temporal lobe network. I went up just to try area 44, and you still don't see much connectivity in temporal lobe. It's more frontal. So yeah, I mean, this is what are the connectivities of these areas? That's something that we're super interested in and are exploring extensively right now.
Jason Sia asks, as surgeons, when we resect premotor areas, we often produce an SMA syndrome with non-flaccid paralysis of the affected side that recovers in the majority of cases over a few weeks. You mentioned that there is some bilaterality in the evidence behind the dorsal premotor laryngeal area. Other than the one case you referred to earlier, can you speculate or discuss long-term consequences of resection in the premotor laryngeal area?
That's a good question. I've asked my neurosurgeon friends, because people don't worry about resecting Brocas area so much anymore. You can take it out without much trouble long term. I asked Nitin Tandon, who's my neurosurgeon collaborator, because he sees effects in more dorsal premotor all the time. He's working on his own paper on this topic. I said, what do you think about resecting this area? And he, if I recall correctly, he said, I'm a little more nervous about resecting that area. So I don't know. I don't think it's been studied extensively. I suspect, just based on chronic lesion data, you can damage a lot of the frontal lobe, focal damage in a lot of different regions, not a big chunk, and still end up pretty okay. So there's probably some bilateral capacity here, but it's an area that needs to be investigated for sure. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Enriqueta Canseco Gonzalez. If I understand this dual system correctly, would you predict that the ventral system may be involved in sign language, but not the dorsal system? maybe it is crazy to even try to connect this to sign language.
Hi, Enriqueta. Hi, how's it going? Enriqueta, for all of you, was my graduate school office mate back at Brandeis University, working with Edgar Zurich. Good to hear from you, Enriqueta. You know, sign language is interesting. We did some early lesion work on sign language where there was damage to the inferior frontal gyrus pretty selectively, and we saw some effects of bimanual coordination of the two effectors. Certainly, we see more dorsal involvement. In both cases, the hand area is up there, orienting with the hand gesture. Gosh, it's a great question. I haven't had the time to look. I'll have to start thinking about that. But no, I don't think it's crazy to think about its connection to sign language at all.
And Enriqueta says, hi, buddy. Thanks and hugs. So thank you very much. I'm sure there's more questions. I'm gonna ask one last one anyway, because I really wanted to. In syntactic functional imaging studies, we've had some very similar observations of this more dorsal premotor type area that you get when you contrast, for example, once again, object clefts and object relatives, for example, right? And subject clefts. Syntactically complex sentence processing, you also get an area that might actually be close to what you're talking about. And it's very similar to the speech functional imaging studies, where you always kind of get that extra cluster up there, which you showed at the beginning of your talk. It reminded me a lot of our own studies. When we see that area, we don't really know what to do with it, right? But in that case, it would suggest some kind of cognitive component, not a speech component, right? So do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know if it's cognitive or not. I mean, we know, those of you who study prosody and its effect on comprehension, we know that prosodic effects in sentence comprehension are real. I think Courtney Hilton did some work recently showing that these rhythmic aspects of prosody affect sentence comprehension, for example. So yeah, I'm not sure. There may be some, you know, if, like William has claimed, that we kind of use syntactic articulatory systems for helping us process complex sentences as a kind of linear recoding, maybe there's a prosodic component that can also be used to group phrases and morphemes in phrases to help assist unpacking them in comprehension.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And that could also play a role in disambiguation of different, yeah. Cool. Yep. Thank you so much. And that does bring us to the end of our session today. Thank you, Greg, for talk. Thank you to the audience. And we hope to see you all back in 2022 on January 13th. That's correct. January 13th with Natalie Busby on brain health. So happy holidays, a Merry New Year, and see you next time. Bye-bye.